Meek talks about Islam and slavery in Africa. For the Muslim, the jihad is the normal and legitimate method of converting the heathen. But throughout Nigerian history, especially in the later days of the Fulani Empire, holy wars were generally undertaken for the purely secular and selfish purpose of obtaining additional slaves. Many pagan communities, no doubt, embraced Islam in order to save themselves from slavery. But the Muslim rule that a believer cannot be sold as a slave was not always observed. Slaves were the main source of income for the Fulani states, and it was not therefore to the interests of the governors to make pagan converts. The institution of slavery is a pivotal feature of Islamic society, and we are justified in charging Muhammadanism with the devastated and desolated condition in which northern Nigeria was found at the beginning of this century. Nevertheless, we must remember that the pagan tribes themselves had been accustomed to enslave each other, and that the institution of slavery has been regarded by many historians as a necessary means of progress for tribes rising from a state of barbarism to that of commercial and industrial peoples." End quote. Meek next goes into much detail on some human sacrifice and cannibalism customs that his profession as an anthropologist required him to notice. Quote, "Human sacrifice is another feature of Jukan Yoruba culture. It is not characteristic of ancestor worship, though I have known of 3 cases within the last few years of human victims being offered to the ancestral spirits of the town. In 2 of these cases, the victims were strangers who were seized and sacrificed, and in the 3rd case, the victim was one who had given offense to the community by betraying the town to slave raiders some 20 years ago. This man was tied up, given beer for a few days, and then taken to the ancestral shrine, where he was secretly stabbed, his cries being thought by the assembled townspeople to be the cries of the ancestral spirits as they bore their victim off. In the first 2 cases, it would appear that the victims were slain with the idea of satiating offended forefathers, and in the last there was probably also the double conception of punishment and expiation. These penal and expiatory ideas appear among some cannibal tribes, where certain criminals were killed and eaten by the chief and people. It may be that the custom of king-killing was an expiatory sacrifice on behalf of the whole community, and this idea of vicarious sacrifice seems to appear also among the tribes, who killed twin children on the ground, that their continuance in the world would endanger the life of the father and mother. The Rukaba of Rishini, with the same intention, used to sacrifice a victim to the ancestral spirits every 7 years. A strong young man was forcibly caught and deposited in the sacred shrine. He was given 2 calabashes, one for drink and one for food. Every week a goat was brought to him, which he slaughtered and ate. He allowed his hair to grow long. His person was taboo, and anyone who touched him or his belongings would automatically die. If he left his hut and came to the village, all would run away. If he died, he was replaced by another young man, but if he lived, he was ceremonially killed with arrows at the end of 7 years. Among the Jukan Igbira, Igara, Idoma, Chamba, Arago, Ankwa, and the various Yoruba tribes, when a chief dies, his favorite wife and slaves were buried with him, to minister to his wants in the future world. So also, the gods required to be constantly supplied with attendants, and the immolation of slaves was a regular feature of the life of these peoples. The victim was especially chosen for his strength and beauty, and during the interval before the sacrifice, he was the most privileged man in the community. Nothing was denied him. He was given the finest clothes and food, and could have sexual relations with any woman in the town. He was the bearer of countless private messages to the spirits of the dead. Among the Yoruba, the social lust for human blood reached its highest point, and the Igbid priest of Owa told me that he had sacrificed as many as 10 human victims on a single day. The occasions that called for human sacrifice were countless. When a great man died, his slaves were sacrificed wholesale, the severed heads of the victims being held over the fetish until they were drained of blood. Among the Yoruba, the god Olori Merin demanded a newborn child each year. Anyone rendered unconscious by lightning was immediately dispatched by the priest of Shango. For Shango, the god of lightning, had thus signified his need of him. If the village contemplated war, human sacrifices had to be made to Ogun, that the war might end successfully. The victim's head was severed, on the stool of the god. The entrails were exposed before the image, and the body was suspended from a tree. The corpse was treated with veneration, for though only a slave, he would be born again as a king. A man and a woman were sacrificed at the coronation of the Alafin of Oyo, who was required to walk over the grave of the victims. On the Alafin's death, human sacrifice was also offered. Among the Igbira virgins were commonly sacrificed to an image, representing a maiden holding in her lap a bird seated on a nest. The Koro also offered human sacrifice. And among most of the tribes who practiced trial by ordeal, the life of the guilty party was taken in expiation of his crime. End quote. Here is Meek on the headhunting and cannibal tribes of Nigeria and beyond. The headhunting and cannibal tribes are located in the central pagan belt, extending from Yola to the confines of Zaria province. All the cannibal tribes were headhunters, but many headhunting tribes were not cannibal and deny ever having been so. Some of these protest too much, as they have clearly only recently abandoned anthropophagy. The headhunting tribes were the Munshi Ataka, Kagoma, Ankwa, Koji, Bolwa, Chukan, Kinuku, Kagoro, Kibalo, Airigu, Basinch, Bochama, Idoma, Jira, Bata, Okpoto, Urkum, Anaguta, Hilmada, Teria, Barom, Tera, Katab Igbira, and Ketimi. The following tribes were admittedly cannibal: the Tangali, Montoil, Waja, Kamut, Lauda, Angas, Yergum Chum, Rukuba, Sura, Warjawa, Ganawuri, Garawuri, Garawa, Zumpa, Perital, Nongu, Plain Mada, Pei, Borak, Hilangaz, Mama, Kushi, Hingri, Gusum, Pero, Tiasi, Tawai, Bangunji, Kalari, Engel. The acquisition of an enemy's head is the young man's passport to manhood. Until he has attained this distinction, his social status is no better than that of a girl, and no girl would consent to marry him. But when he has won his trophy, and can prove that it was obtained in the manner prescribed by custom, he can take his place in the ranks of the warriors, and his prowess is celebrated by a public feast. The Ganawari warriors observed similar rites of purification. They carried home their heads on the points of their spears and handed them over to the Sarkanzafi, who subsequently returned them, each one to the slayer. The young warriors then joined in a dance, holding their spears and unsheathed knives in their right hands, each headwinner being followed by a friend who exhibited on a stick the severed head. The heads were then delivered to the religious chief, who alone with members of his family could eat the flesh of heads. Next morning, all the warriors betook themselves to a stream and washed their weapons clean of human blood. No women might be present at the headhunters' dance, but next day a festival was held, in which women and children took part. Among the Igbira, anyone aspiring to the title of Osagi had to obtain a head. He took the head to the village shrine and cleaned it of flesh by immersion in some corroding liquid. He then slew a red and black ram and mixed the blood with pieces of the dried-up heart and kidney of some enemy slain in war. He drank this mixture and thereafter could face any danger without fear. Many of the headhunting tribes were also cannibals. Not merely did they ceremonially eat the flesh of the captured head, but they devoured as well the other parts of the bodies of their enemies. The Ganawari removed the flesh of their fallen foes, leaving only the bones and intestines. They rode home with the flesh spitted on their spears, and handed it over to the religious chief, who divided it out among the old men. The Sarkanzafis portion was the flesh of the head. The hair was first removed, and then the flesh was stripped off, cooked, and eaten at the sacred shrine. The old men cooked their flesh in a pot, and ate it in a cave beside the shrine. This was done on the night of the warrior's return, but the young men themselves might not be partakers. The Ganawari only ate the flesh of enemies slain in war. They say that they never killed and ate enemy women, but that their neighbors, the Ataka, did. The Tangali headhunters ate the flesh of the heads of enemy women, but without observing any ceremonial rites. Among the Tangali, the human flesh was, as among the Ganawari, the prerogative of the old men. But they might, if they chose, give pieces to the young warriors. Occasionally, even old women would be allowed to partake. The flesh was eaten ceremonially beneath the sacred tree that guarded each compound. Rukuba cannibals ate the flesh of their captured enemies at their sacred shrine. Old men alone might eat, but the young men were smeared with the oily soup left over in the pot in which the human flesh had been boiled, a custom similar to that of the human leopards of Sierra Leone. Zumperi warriors handed over the captured heads to the fathers to eat, they themselves being satisfied with licking the blood off their weapons. The Kaleri ate their enemies killed in war, and they would, until recently, have killed and eaten any stranger who entered their country. The Yurgum cooked the flesh of their enemies 2 days after the warrior's return. The head was boiled separately, and only those who had killed a man in war could eat the flesh of the head. But the remainder of the flesh could be eaten by anyone, women and children included. Even the entrails were eaten, the intestines being cleaned with running water and ashes. The Jarawa ceremonially ate the flesh of the head, the hair being removed by coating the head with mud and then heating the mud in a fire. The Hill Anyas say that they never ate the flesh of young lads captured in battle, nor of elderly men. The lads could be sold into slavery, and the flesh of elderly men was too dried up to be palatable. The Sura cannibals boiled the flesh of their captured enemies with salt and oil and ate it ceremonially. No women were allowed to see it. Young men were forced by their seniors to partake in order to increase their courage. Among all the cannibal tribes, the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet were considered the titbits of the body. Criminals of their own community were eaten by certain cannibal tribes. The Angas dealt in this way with persons sentenced to death. The Sura chief ate the flesh of women convicted of adultery, and among the Warjawa, anyone who violated tribal law was sacrificed in the sacred grove, his blood being poured out as a libation, and his flesh consumed by the people. Human flesh is precious food, for as these primitive peoples believe that the gods eat the sacrifice, what more palatable gift can be offered than a human victim? The Jarawa threw dead criminals into the bush, but it is suggested that there was an exchange of such bodies between the Dagarawa and themselves, both being cannibals, but not as regards their own people. The cannibal Angas villagers exchanged their dying old men, a custom connected with animistic ideas, as the skull of the man eaten was immediately returned to his relatives to become an object of adoration. A Monshi expressed to me the opinion that the main object of the shaft and tunnel grave was to conceal as much as possible the site of burial, and so prevent carnivorous animals and cannibal men from digging up the corpse and eating it. At the funeral feast of the Angas chief, the skulls captured from neighboring tribes were brought by the guests and bandied about by the dancers. End quote. This video will close with Meek talking about the pre-colonial custom of natives burying their slaves and wives alive with their corpse at their funerals. The Dokakari mark, the grave by mounds, with elaborate symbols typifying the pursuits of the occupant, such as wrestling or hunting. The grave of the chief is marked by models of a woman, a slave, or horse. Among many tribes, the favorite wife was placed, alive or dead, in the tomb of her dead husband. This was the custom among the Igbed and other Yoruba tribes, and the first wife of an Arago, Jukan, or Chamba chief, was on her husband's death stunned with a club, her neck wrung, and the body placed in the tomb beside that of her husband. The Arago chief's favorite child and horse were also buried with him, together with half his possessions. The favorite slave of the Chamba chief was killed to accompany his master, and the favorite slave of the Jukan chief of Ankpa had his legs broken and was placed alive in his owner's tomb. This was the custom also among the Idoma, who buried alive with the chief 2 of his slaves, one at the deceased's head and one at his feet. In the same tribe also, even when a commoner died, it was the custom to sacrifice 1 or more of his slaves. And this was the general custom also among the Igbid, Igbira, Bassa, Bunu, Oro, and O. The sacrifice of wives was common among the Igbira and Yoruba, and Landa describes how 2 wives of a lately deceased chief hid themselves in order to avoid being clubbed to death. One was discovered and forced to drink poison, which very soon killed her. 2 years ago, when I visited Agbia, the Olu of Aworo came to see me before my departure. He said he was getting an old man, and asked if the funerary honors which had been paid to his predecessor would be allowed in his case also when he died. His predecessor, Ajeto, died in 1895, and to mark the importance of the event, about 20 slaves were immolated. Some of his wives were also slaughtered, and others were buried alive with their husband. Several little boys and girls were entombed to fetch water and light the old man's pipe, and the cries of these little ones were heard 3 or 4 days after. Precious stones, and other treasures of the dead chief, were buried with him, and 6 cases of gin to slake the old man's thirst. So many good things, in fact, were put into the grave, that a constant guard has had to be kept there ever since." End quote. Thanks for watching.